Hello and welcome to this November edition of Book Talk with Jordan and Stefan. Today we're going to be taking a look at Slade House by David Mitchell. David Mitchell was the author of Cloud Atlas, which was made into the Wachowski movie a few years ago of the same name. While I had not read the original book Cloud Atlas, that had prompted me to check out Slade House, which seemed rather interesting. And I'm going to normally I don't usually like to just read jacket copy to set it up, but I wanted to give the reader an opportunity to hear what it was that made me want to read this particular book, what it made me want to try it. So this is the jacket copy. Keep your eyes peeled for a small black iron door. Down the road from a working-class pub along a narrow brick alley, you just might find the entrance to Slade House. A stranger will greet you by name and invite you inside. At first, you won't want to leave. Later, you'll find out that you can't. Every 9 years, the residents of Slade House extend an invitation to someone who's different or lonely, a precocious teenager, a recently divorced policeman, a shy college student, but what really goes on inside? For those who find out, it's already too late. Now, that sounds like it's going to be a book that delivers the goods, and I selected this one for our Halloween edition of Book Talk, and what ultimately happened was we have been a month off ever since my move to Marietta, and it looks like we will continue to be a month off because this book ended up getting pushed all the way into November because it is just so boring, so poorly structured, so badly written that to quote Short Circuit 2, it's slower than molasses in January, and I mean, Stefan, you had burned through the book much faster than me, and so you knew immediately, long before I did, how miserable a reading experience it was, and I can't believe that I am bashing on a book this hard, but at the same time, I am just kind of aghast at how poorly done this was. So, quickly summarizing from the jacket copy, and then I'll turn it over to you, Stefan, because I know you had a lot you wanted to say about this. But the idea is that there is this mythical place in the UK, in London, somewhere called Slade House, and every 9 years... Oh, by the way, spoiler alert big time. We are not going to hold back on the spoilers on this one because there is absolutely no reason to keep you to keep you in suspense about any of this. There's no reason to prompt you to read any of this, so we're just going to burn through every possible spoiler there is. The idea is there's this mythical place called Slade House, and every 9 years Slade House appears, and circumstances arise such that an unsuspecting person is lured inside, and they are lured inside, and they find an environment that is just wonderful for whatever their personal hopes and desires are. You know, you have the precocious teenager that finds a friend at last. You have a lonely policeman that finds true love, and all of that. And then, lo and behold, everything becomes dark and sinister and creepy. You try to leave the house and you can't, which kept getting Hotel California stuck in my head, and then all of a sudden you're paralyzed, and you find out that this house is a sort of spiritual way station for these two twins that are ghosts that are immortal in some way, and every 9 years they have to devour a soul to stay alive, and it just gets unbelievably repetitive. I kept imagining the twins as being the Lutesses from BioShock Infinite.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, but it keeps getting unbelievably repetitive because every chapter, it's like every chapter is set up to be about a different character every 9 years getting lured into Slade House. And so what happens is you have chapter after chapter of uninteresting, unnecessary backstory for these characters that most of them are never seen or heard from again, or if they are, it's only very briefly. And you have one unnecessary chapter after another. These characters don't connect. 99% of their backstory is completely uninteresting and irrelevant. And you have, well, we'll go into it, some of the real deep structural problems in a minute, but the simple fact of the matter is that there's just nothing tying these events together in a satisfying way, and you get kind of the feeling that it's like so much of this was done, so much of the action is done outside of the narrative that we're reading in a way. Like, you just feel like with these characters, there's one character, for example, that is coming to Slade House to try to find her sister who was in Slade House, was a victim of Slade House in the previous chapter, and she has come to a point where she is on the verge of finding Slade House and all of that, but you realize there was this whole backstory, this whole investigation that we never got to see. It took place off camera, so to speak. And it's cool, I guess, that you can you can imply so much, but part of the reason you can imply it is because it's all cliche. It's all stock. It's all been done. So, it's like if you, I mean, it really is like if you just take every horror trope in the book and throw it in a blender, because everybody knows these things, so you don't have to go into a great deal of detail about them. We've been seeing these things on Scooby-Doo since we were kids.
There actually is a Scooby-Doo scenario.
There is. The very last chapter is almost like a trans-dimensional Scooby-Doo cast comes to save the day, and you keep wanting to see like a metrosexual and an ascot and a stoner hippie with his talking dog and all of this. It is bad. It really is. Stefan, I'm going to turn it over to you. Let's just let it out.
Okay, well, I'm going to get there at a point, but just to reiterate, the worst thing about this whole experience was that it's basically taking the genre of fantasy or fantasy horror and doing every single trope, every pattern you've ever heard of. I don't know why this was done. It's really the most unoriginal thing you've seen. Like, it has zombies, it has possessions, it has telepathy, it has ghosts, it has vampires, it has vampire hunting groups, it has time travel, witchcraft, creepy houses, it has the actual the Scooby-Doo club group, the womanizing jock, the fat chick, the hot chick. There's a conversation about the soul as it's a real thing, which is so medieval fantasy crap. There's a dream world, things you never do in writing. You do not create dream worlds unless that is a main point you're trying to address. There's astral projection, there's astral world traveling. It's really on a whole other level of fantasy genre trope you've never seen before. And you sort of figure this out the first chapter. You're like, well, that was weird. Maybe it's starting off generic and going to go into somewhere else. Nope, it keeps doing that, and that's one of the major problems. But before we start going into all the problems, let's actually talk about the good things, because this author, he does have skill, he does have talent. He was just screwed up in content, I think. I think the structure was fine, but because of the structure was so forced, everything seemed bad as a result. So let's actually get into the good parts. And I did actually enjoy some of the characters as briefly as we saw them. They were believable to the point of being different. So, when one was talking or one was thinking, you actually, oh yeah, this is this character and she has these feelings, and that's great. It is highly structured, even though it's forced, as Jordan said, every 9 years. It's basically a description of what a serial killer would do to trap someone. It's easy to understand in that regard, so you know what you're getting into. Okay, this chapter, this is going to happen, that's fine. There's also, important to me, very perfect grammar. I mean, you think that's strange nowadays, but nope, when you find a book that has perfect grammar, you're like, okay, he crossed all his T's, he dotted every sentence, perfect. I totally appreciate that. And because it is fantasy horror, there were actually some genuinely creepy scenes. It didn't scare me, but it sort of make you go, oh, that's kind of like, this is kind of like the paintings and this long hallway, and there's this old woman. It's I get that feeling, that creepy vibe. So there was that. What did you actually have to say something good about this story? There has to be something.
Okay, well, as you were describing those things, it's funny. I am a huge King Diamond fan, and if you're not familiar with King Diamond, he was the original and only lead singer of Merciful Fate, and which was this very dark, satanic metal band, and one of the first metal bands to be, truly like Hail Satan, everything that the PMRC was terrified of and everything. And when he went solo, he launched a career doing these kind of horror concept albums where it was he would tell a story, a dark, disturbing horror story narrative throughout the album. And it's sort of, if you listen to his albums, it's kind of like Trans-Siberian Orchestra Goes to Hell. And so as I was reading it, I was thinking, this could work as a King Diamond concept album, like, where like every chapter is a different character getting sucked into it and everything. Like that way it could work. I mean, in something like that, where it's more of a song format or something, or a different kind of format for telling the story, it could work. And I liked some of the description of certain things. The paintings,
yes,
the paintings were very disturbing. And what we mean by the paintings is there is a long series of paintings in the hallways of Slade House of these different people, and what happens is every person in Slade House that goes into Slade House eventually walks down this hallway, and and they get to the last painting of the line, and it's a picture of them, and so they know that their number is up. That was the first time the first time that it happened, that was eerie, even though it is very cliche. I mean, it's not like you're going to see a painting of yourself in a house you've never been in before and then everything's hunky dory. We know that that's pretty much a very foreboding idea, but it was eerie the first time, and the first few times he described the process of these soul vampires, if you will, if we just go ahead and use the term, devouring souls, sucking the souls out of the body, and these people like watching their souls leave their bodies. And at one point the narration says, like I'm no longer this person, I am the shell of this person, and that feeling of their fundamental concept of themselves leaving their body while their consciousness remains. That was very creepy. That was very unsettling the first few times, and then after that it was just like, I'm just imagining the heart ripping out scene in Indiana Jones Temple of Doom, Kali Ma, Om Nam Shivai, Om Nam Shivai, and all of that. That's literally what I'm thinking at that point. And so it just every possible good thing he just flushed down the toilet over and over again.
Yeah, the one thing about that whole talk, like whenever you talk about the soul and the mind, my background goes to my reading of philosophy of Descartes and his Cartesian dualism, how he talks about the soul and the mind being essentially the same thing, and that's how we see philosophy sort of segregate itself from theology in the Middle Ages. So when you do that, when you start talking about the soul, you really have to pay a lot of attention to the words you're using and why, because you're going to alienate the intelligent side of your fan base who knows that talking about the soul is a really old, unendearing concept, and you really have to do something else. And he sort of did. He created this term called psychic static, or some sort of energy, that if he just used that and didn't even mention the soul, I'd be like, you know what, I could pass this. I could actually read this and say this is okay. Because he's trying to make the attempt of talking about some magical property that exists in the world of supernatural fantasy. That's totally fine. But as soon as you say soul, you've got a mountain to climb to get your readers back on board. It's like, okay, what is the soul? Is it physical? Oh, it is physical. It's a glob. It's a globular floating. It's like, what are you talking about? It's really hard for me to digest that. And that's sort of my half and half. If they stuck with the technical side of things, just on a brief level, it would have been okay, I think. But as soon as you say soul, everything goes downhill. And that was the first chapter. The first chapter had 3 things. This is just me, that you never ever do in a story unless that's the point of the story. And you never do them in this order or this together. 1, you do not have the narration from a child. It's usually a bad idea unless, again, that's the point. You want to tell a story from a child's perspective. At this point, I was like, okay, what kind of child is this? I didn't even know whether we were in the UK or not until I got some of the mannerisms of the rest of the people speaking. Oh, okay, I guess they're British. And then you find out he's 13, and I'm like, that no way. I thought he was 6 or 5. There's no way a kid this could be talking like that or thinking like that. They must have been a lot more intelligent if you were 13. So that's one thing I sort of say people not to do when they're writing. The second thing you do, or don't do, is put someone on drugs narrating the story, because then you're like, okay, can I believe what this guy's telling me? Is his perceptions totally messed up? Unless, of course, that is the point of your story. You want to tell a story about a guy who's on drugs, whose perceptions are off. But you combine that as a kid who's now on drugs, then you're like, whoa, okay, what kind of perceptions does this child have? Can I relate to that? Absolutely not. And then on top of that, you then put him inside a whimsical dream world. So now you have no idea how old this guy is or what he's perceiving. Now he's on drugs, and now he's in this physical dream world. You're lost. This is the first chapter. Now, some of that dream world is cool. The running around, the nursery rhymes. That was typical fantasy horror stuff. But I can't fathom where the hell this is taking place. What's going on? And
exactly.
Again, this is the first chapter.
And
so.
it took. I mean, the architecture. You talk about knowing if it's in the UK or not. The architecture of Slade House is very hard to define. I was constantly. What's described, it sounds like from the outset, it sounds like Slade House is a row house, but then when they walk, there's a garden that they walk through, and the garden somehow, I guess It's a supernatural thing, but if it is, how they walk into this garden and don't know that it's a supernatural thing, but this garden is suddenly epic in size. It's like, it's got this, it's almost labyrinthine, and so if they're stepping into this other world where a row house garden suddenly becomes huge and vast once you've crossed the threshold, how do they not know that the jig is up right there? And that's such an important thing when you're writing horror. It's such an important thing when writing horror that you don't put your characters into a situation where they should know something that they don't know, or vice versa, where they know things they shouldn't already know. And that one of the things that really irks me about this book is that it breaks 2 of my cardinal sins for storytelling, and that is, 1, having characters that only exist for the sake of giving exposition. One of the only character names you'll remember from this book is Fred Pink, and Fred Pink exists only to tell the story of Slade House. He spends an entire chapter giving exposition. That's all he's there for, and for no other reason. He does not, he doesn't, I mean, he's mentioned as, being relevant to the events, but he really, as a functionary, he really has no other purpose than to just tell the story of Slade House and these twin soul vampires, and that's it. And it's almost like we don't even know really how he knows all this. He just does. And then the other thing that they do, and I hate this, it is one of my biggest pet peeves in writing, and the soul vampire twins do this, and that is when two characters are having a conversation where they repeat things that to each other that they both already know, just so that the author has an opportunity to give exposition, force exposition in there. It's like, in TV shows when, character gets a call from her sister and she picks up the phone and says, "Oh, hi, sis." No one says that in reality. Nobody says that. You just pick up the phone and say, "Oh, hey." The only reason she's saying "hi, sis" is to tell the audience that her sister is on the other end of the line, and it's that kind of clunky expositional dialogue that I hate. And the number one way that I hate hearing that is when it's two characters gloating about what they've done, and they talk about it like they are, they are so impressed and so fascinated with what they've been able to pull off and get away with that they have to one of them has to walk through each step of it in apparent disbelief because they can't believe they pulled it off. So, it's kind of like, let's say we robbed a bank and I'm talking to you and I say, "I cannot believe how easy that was. First, we pulled out our guns, then we went up to the bank teller, then we said, 'Fill up the bag,' and wouldn't you know it, they did, and they even shut off the alarms, and we were able to get away scot-free. And now we're sitting in this getaway car, driving to the pickup point. Oh my God, I can't believe we were..."
It is worse than, it is actually worse than what way that Jordan's describing it. An entire chapter exists. Well, there's three major things that I would say are tropes outside of the fantasy tropes that you either don't do or you do very carefully. And the one that Jordan was describing was called Bond villain stupidity, where Bond or the Bond villain has Bond and he's, "Oh, I've captured you and you're going to die like this and this is my master plan." And that happens in chapter 3. That is one of the main reasons for chapter 3 to exist. And there's absolutely no reason for this person to tell this story. At that point, there's no, you can make it so that you could charm her, but she's already in your clutches. There's no reason to keep going. You can make stuff up. She's still going to believe you. You're controlling her mind at that point. It doesn't matter what you say. So that was one of the only reasons the author had to have exposition on how the hell this entire scenario even came about and how they're doing all this crap. And it was so obvious. You're like, why did you even attempt that? But then you realize there's nothing else he could have done. How else could he have done that? Oh, right. I wrote an entire book on the history of these kids because there was a teacher that they were traveling the world with because they were telepathic at birth and they taught them all this mysticism. They went around the world and he wanted to make money off them. So he wrote 20 book copies and he sold them, or he sent them off to the world. And the sister or the brother and sister found those out and burned them. And you're like, how do we know this? Because the brother told the Bond person who's about to die because no one cares anyway. And you're like, okay, thanks, that was great. And then you have to look at the other chapters for their worth. And there's like Chekhov's gun, which occurs in the first chapter, occurs in the second chapter, occurs in the third chapter, that is forgotten until the end of the next chapter. And it doesn't really do much. And you're like, what was the point of Chekhov's gun? And then we get back to the worst of them all, which is the Deus Ex, which is the entire last chapter. The vampire hunter group is revealed. It's like, what? Where did these guys come from? They've been existing all this. It's like the coin, the opposite end of the coin of the vampire ghosts, and these are like immortal people who are just running around finding vampires. Because there was no other way to stop these guys unless you had some Deus Ex pop in and say, "Oh, you're gonna jigs up. I'm gonna stop you guys," and you're like, "What? Why? How? When? Who?"
Yeah, precisely. I mean, this is what is amazing to me. Is it's like, I would expect a creepypasta author to screw some of this up. Some, just a random, blogger writing some spooky stuff. I would expect that, and I would even allow for it. But this is a New York Times best-selling author. This novel was a New York Times bestseller. And this is somebody who, I mean, stand this book up lengthwise and measure the width. It is that many, that like inch and a half or whatever width. That much space is being unnecessarily occupied on bookstore shelves that could go to actual quality literature. I mean, Barnes & Noble, you carry my novel. You could be stocking it on your shelves in place of this.
And I remember making a joke about how this was a well-written but unnecessarily long Tales of the Crypt episode.
Yeah.
That's giving it too much credence to this book. Tales of the Crypt is much better. It is that, like, if you appreciate writing, you could appreciate this guy's grammar, the structure, the sense of horror. It's there. You can appreciate that. But everything else, this could have been written by a grade schooler.
Yeah.
With obviously better grammar. But that's it. Yeah. It is that contrived and trite and just poorly executed. So there's nothing really to learn from this. There's nothing I could say, you know what, if you read this, you could probably figure out. No, it's all just a waste. And I could cut out the first 2 chapters. I could cut out the last chapter. And I think the third and the fourth chapter would be something. I mean, you could actually say there's a plot here. There's a continuation. There's continuity. And then if you like that, you'd say, hey, author, could you please write a continuation? Could you write a second or third chapter? Yeah, I think that would have been reasonable. It still wouldn't have been very good, but it still would actually be okay. Yeah, I see what you're trying to do here.
Yeah. Well, you know what? It's like, you know what it is? What would have been really interesting, that whole exposition about the history of these soul vampire twins and all of this stuff, that whole exposition that Fred Pink gives, just make that the book. Write that whole thing as an elaborate book where you tell this beautiful life story of these, freakish children that have these wild psychic adventures and everything. That could have been a book. But I think part of it, I think what happens, and this is something that Mark Z. Danielewski, who's one of my favorite, wrote one of my favorite books called House of Leaves, and then everything else he's written has been complete and utter crap. What happens is they hit on a unique structuring device, and then they spend the rest of, and it works beautifully for one novel, and then they spend the rest of their literary careers just masturbating over it. And Cloud Atlas is famous for having these densely interwoven characters, and that their relationships are interconnected across space and time, and it's just fiendishly multi-layered. And so it seems like he was trying to do a little light version of that with this novel, and it just doesn't work here. I haven't read Cloud Atlas, and I'm not. I after reading this, I don't really want to, because I just don't want to waste my or worry that I'm going to be wasting my time. That said, I did look up a bunch of. I tried to look into background of this book a little bit. I read some of the 1-star reviews on Amazon, and don't get me wrong, there are plenty of 4 and 5-star people who really liked it, but the 1-star reviews were saying that they were mostly from people who said, like, I'm a huge fan of this author, and this is just a big misfire, just a big misstep. And one person was like, they named literally every other book he's written and said, I loved all of those. This was just crap. And so I guess in a way, I mean, it's almost like if you're discovering, you could say it's like if you're discovering Metallica for the first time by way of Saint Anger, And so this is that may be part of what was so off-putting. I also found out that some of the characters in this are actually characters recurring from other books that he's written. So there's kind of a connected universe here. It's sort of like H.P. Lovecraft and everybody went to Miskatonic University. So that may contribute to some of our irritants and confusion. I don't know. I mean, like you say, something like the Deus Ex Machina, some of these things should not occur in a good, well-structured story at all. But this feels like it's almost like a supplemental story to, it feels like it's almost a supplemental story to these other larger works. I mean, but at the same time, it's kind of like when David Lynch apparently said that Lost Highway is set in the same universe as Twin Peaks, and you're like, well, okay, well, what does that even mean? It doesn't. I mean, I love Lost Highway and I love Twin Peaks. I just don't get what difference that makes that they're in the same universe. And it's the same kind of thing here. One thing opportunity I wanted to take, and I'll hand it back over to you, was this thing of, kind of, we had talked about how, like, privately we had talked about how horror as a genre is something that is so easy to drop the ball on. It's so easy to just turn it into cliche crap, and I say that because the two of the worst novels I have ever read were horror novels. The second worst novel I've ever read was called A Good and Happy Child. I cannot think of the author's name off the top of my head, but it starts out like a lot of bad horror. It starts out with an interesting premise. It's a book about a guy who has to go into therapy because he cannot hold his infant son. He can't touch his infant son or be around his new baby because it brings up all of these horrible repressed memories. And it just and the reason that book doesn't work is because it's like the author basically thinks we're a bunch of inattentive fools. At one point towards the end of the book, the guy says, I want people to talk about my father the way I talk about so-and-so, and he mentions this famous baseball player. I can't remember who it is, but he mentions this person, and he says, for some reason, I could never shut up about the name of famous baseball player. I had a whole box of baseball cards under my bed, and I never shut up about it, and I never stopped talking about him. It's like, wait a minute. We got through the entire book. You've never mentioned this person once. You don't get to just show up and say, "Oh, by the way, I need, I love this guy, and now, I'm having this major psychological breakthrough as a character because I'm just suddenly adding this whole interest in baseball and this baseball player." It's like, no, fuck you. You've been, the whole time you've been this weird reclusive music nerd. That said absolutely nothing about baseball. You don't get to just tell us that all you do is talk about this baseball character. So that kind of thing. Then the absolute worst book I've ever read, and the worst horror novel I've ever read, certainly, was Lives of the Monster Dogs by Kirsten Bacchus. And words almost cannot describe how badly written that book is. It is a book about how there are these dogs. It's one of those things where it's very obviously based on a dream she had, and it's about these dogs that walk upright. They have human arms and hands that have been attached, Island of Dr. Moreau style, and they
that sounds disgusting.
Yeah, it was disgusting, but not particularly well described, so you could read it while you're eating. They walk upright and they can talk, and they're very educated and intelligent, and they're reading, or the reading of the book. The whole thing, the story is told from the point of view of a ditzy, airheaded college girl, and then that would be fine for that character, but every single character in the book sounds like a ditzy, airheaded college girl, and then you come to realize it's because this thing was written by a ditzy, airheaded college girl, and and it's this idea of like the dogs come to New York City, and everyone in New York City just accepts the dogs and welcomes them into the upper echelons of New York City high life because New Yorkers are just kind of cool that way. We're just a little bit more ahead of everything.
Oh God!
It's I'm sorry. No New Yorker, nobody on the planet is so far ahead and so cool and so progressive that they can just casually accept talking dogs with human arms and hands. Okay,
that's another whole world of weird. It's not we shouldn't get into.
Right. And that book, by the way, one of the things I hated about that book was I realized you get to a point towards the end of that book where you realize the dogs have been stockpiling gunpowder for some reason throughout the whole book, and you realize it's all just so that we can build up to have this big Hollywood-style explosion as we jump out a window at the end, It was just such crap, and then I read this interview with her, and she says, well, I guess they said, summarize your book or set it up for us. She says, well, I guess it's like Frankenstein with dogs.
Oh, God.
Well, okay, so first of all, you're already building your book off of one of the biggest cliches in horror history, and then also, you guess that's what it's about? You're guessing what your own
book... back to this story, I mean, what went through my head, the first chapter is like, okay, there's going to have to be a lot of different ways the chapters are going to flow, or this is actually going to be an anti-hero story, because the only progression, the only continuity through this story are the two twins. So there has to be one twin who has some redeemable qualities, who has an about face, who says, I want to stop killing people, or I want to change things. And that's pretty much what you'd have to do in a story like this, because the main characters are the bad guys. So it's either going to be an ending where the bad guys win, which I think technically sort of happened in this one, or there's a redemption story. So, do you really want to read a story about serial murderers who get away with everything, and then gets a contrived ending where a cabal of vampire hunters comes out of nowhere and kills them all? Sort of, kind of. Even the ending itself was bad in that regard, because it's not definitive. It's sort of like, oh, it could go on. It's like, no. You don't want this thing to go on. No one's going to want a sequel to this. This is crap. So, yeah, if you're going to write an anti-hero story, you got to have something redeemable. Like when you have a normal hero, he has a flaw. When you have a villain, he has to have something nice about them, some backstory that resonates with you. Like they had a family that got killed, and it's always about revenge, and he's finally through his revenge, and he's going back to a normal life, or he doesn't like killing, he doesn't like all this blood. That would have to have happened in the story for us to care about who these guys are, because right now it's just a bunch of pompous. Their powers are out. They're crazy. They can travel anywhere in the world. They can possess people. They know all their memories. They can read minds. They can create dream world. It's just insane. So when you have characters that do all this crap, it's like evil Mary Sue's, I guess. It's just like, oh God, like why are you telling me this? What's the point? If it was just a creepy house and people got lured in and there was like some mythos about it, that could work. But in order to do horror properly, you have to be extremely subtle. But in order to be extremely subtle, you have to have some substance. And when you got all this crap flying around, it's almost impossible to have a concern of drama or comedy or any other of the basic arts to care about anything that's going on in these scenarios. So I don't know I don't know this author. I don't know how else what other stuff he can do. But it feels like something that should have been aborted at the first chapter of a book club, or a creators writing circle said, "Hey, your first chapter is well written, but there's about 20 problems I see. If you clean those up and you go with that, then you'll be fine. This is just a crater in the ground. There's nothing to learn here. You can't build anything off this. You can't pour concrete in the hole and hope to make a foundation." And you see that from the first chapter. So really just avoid this story as best as possible. Do the exact opposite of it if you're going to do horror fantasy. Read Gaiman. Read, there's so many, just anything other than this guy for horror fantasy. I think he'll be just fine.
I think Neil Gaiman, you're right, is probably... That's what if nothing else, that's what it feels like. I was reading this and thinking, Neil Gaiman would look at this book and think, does this make me look fat? And I mean that's the thing. He really is. He's trying so hard to be Neil Gaiman. He's trying so hard to be Tim Burton. He's trying so hard. You know what I really kept as I was reading this? What I kept thinking was, it's like he's hitting every cliche trope in the book because I feel like he wants to
purposely,
he wants to sell another book movie deal. He wants to sell this one, the story rights to this to Hollywood, and maybe get an HBO miniseries out of it or something like that. And he can go off and spend the next 10 years smoking cigars lit with burning 20s. And that's what this felt like. It felt like I am going to try so hard to shove all of the I'm going to try so hard to shove every cliche I can think of into this book. It was like when the Simpsons episode, where also featuring Neil Gaiman, where Homer Simpson writes a book. And he says, I hope it has enough steampunk, whatever that is. I mean, so we could go. I think we're well over the usual time limit for our shows, and I think our readers, our listeners, I should say, get the idea. This book is complete garbage, and it is just a mess. And normally we say that we recommend all the books we read on BookTalk. We don't recommend this one. Neither one of us do. And I think, Stefan, we're going to have to, in books we do in the future, you and I are going to have some kind of system where if we come to a consensus that a book is just complete garbage from the get-go, we just abort the project and move on to another book, because this... We can't just keep having books where that we're just like, this is complete garbage, and this really was.
Well, we read it so you don't have to, and I was hoping for one of the things I talked about, the anti-hero or some redemption story. It never happened. So, yeah, do not read this book. Avoid it. Again, just pick any other random book in the world for fantasy horror. You'll be fine.
Yeah, and I will say our next book coming in December, and this one we will have no trouble getting to you in a timely fashion, because we are, I think, both just enjoying it tremendously. We wanted to do a graphic novel, and Stefan suggested the mother of all graphic novels, Mouse by Art Spiegelman. and we are both reading it. I read it in college and loved it, and I'm reading it again and loving it, and it's absolutely phenomenal. That is going to be a wonderful, fascinating story and a wonderful, fascinating discussion. So just avoid this book like the plague. And I am I am going to now go back to bed and forget that I ever read this trash.
Good night, everyone.
Cheers. If you enjoyed this commentary, please help me continue to bring you more content by making a donation to patreon.com/JordanOwen42. Your contribution will help me turn this channel into a hub of libertarian pop culture discussion and current events commentary. Thank you for listening, and as always, please hit the subscribe button if you haven't already.